conclusive. It does not say that this blood sample could have come from this person and nobody else. It is merely, it includes them in a certain percentage of the population that could have left a stain. And an exclusion is an absolute statement. If I am making an exclusion, I am saying this blood could not have come from that person. If the exclusion is based on a EAPB, then I have concerns with it because I am aware that it can degrade from a BA, that there is another possibility.
The narrative response.
Sustained. State a question, Counsel.
Sir, why is it that you would distinguish between an exclusion and an inclusion for the purposes of this EAPB type marker?
Well, because in the case of conventional serology, it's not a definitive answer. An inclusion does not specifically say this blood came from this person and nobody else, as opposed to an exclusion where it is an absolute statement. If I'm saying this blood could not have come from somebody, that's my statement. It's a absolute.
Okay. And sir, during the course of your years at the serology unit in the Scientific Investigation Division, have you ever had any hesitation of making exclusions when that's what you see on your electropheretogram?
Objection, irrelevant.
I'm not totally sure I understand. Do you mean, have I hesitated making an exclusion if I see a B?
No, in other words, just in general, when something is an exclusion, do you report it as an exclusion?
Yes, I do.
Now, we were talking about the blood vial chart that the defense used yesterday, and some of the transactions involving item number 17. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Now, I was asking you about various pipetters that are used. Did you bring to court the type of pipetter that we were talking about that I referred to as a pipette man, or a mechanical type pipetter?
Yes, I brought one of those.
Can you show us what that looks like?
Mr. Fairtlow, can I get you to move this easel back about a foot? We're obstructing the view of some of the jurors here.
Okay, this, what I'm holding in my hand, it happens to be a Pipette Man brand, what we call a pipetter, a reusable pipetter. It allows you to set the amount that you want to deliver, and you draw it up into a disposable tip.
All right, Mr. Blasier, you're going to have to angle yourself differently here.
The unit is reusable because that's where you set the amount and stuff, but it has a tip on the end of it that is what you're actually drawing the fluid into. They come in different sizes, from very, very fine to this one happens to hold a maximum of 1 milliliter. And you depress the plunger, draw up your fluid, and then press it again to deliver it. When you're done with that sample, there's another plunger on the back that releases the tip from the unit, and that's discarded.
So you discard these tips instead of autoclaving them or somehow sanitizing them to reuse them?
They're not reused.
Why not? Why don't you reuse them in serology?
Because at that point they have another sample in it. It would be inappropriate to use a previously used item like that.
And with the tip, when you discard it, how do you discard it?
Well, the mechanics of it, like I said, is there's a plunger on it. We have biological waste things on the different lab benches, and you don't touch it or anything. It's as simple as just sticking this towards the biological waste and then releasing it, and it's disposed of.
And do you calculate, when you do this procedure, the amount of blood that's left in and on the outside of the pipetter?
No, I do not.
Your Honor, could we possibly take a picture of the pipetter and introduce that as an exhibit? Because I don't want to introduce the pipetter itself.
I would object and ask that the pipetter be introduced.
It's a $300 item, so we prefer to.
Well, count his case, his exhibit.
Can we bring it over here?
$300 for that thing?
Actually, I think that particular model is about that or a little more. There are some cheaper, but they are quite expensive.
Mr. Matheson, in the pipette tube, there's what appears to be a little white stopper. Maybe that's probably not the correct terminology, but you know what I'm referring to in the end of the plastic portion of the pipette tip.
Yes, it's up towards the larger opening of where it attaches to the pipetter.
What's that for?
That is specifically in there, particularly when you're dealing with biological materials, because if you, as you're drawing the fluid up inside the tip, if you do it too quickly, the possibility exists of, because you're actually forming a suction and pulling it, of spraying small particles that can make their way up into the part of the pipetter itself that you reuse. So that plug in there allows the air to pass through, but does not allow any of the biological product to pass.
Now, Mr. Matheson, I'd like to show you next what we've previously marked as 163F for identification. And can you hold that up so the jurors can see it and tell us what that is?
What this is an example of two glass disposable pipettes that we use. One of them has somewhere along the line gotten its tip broken off, but these are, I've made reference to a type of disposable one. They're not calibrated. You don't know how much you're drawing up or how much you're delivering, but you place a small rubber bulb on the top, depress the bulb, place it into the fluid, let the bulb up, and it sucks up the fluid into it.
Okay, so we don't actually have the bulb attachment on these particular items.
No.
And the bulb attachment, I take it, just creates some suction type effect in the disposable pipetter to draw the blood into the pipetter.
That's correct.
Now, did you use any of these types of disposable pipetters, the glass ones, in the work that you did in conjunction with item 17?
Yes, I did.
And how much blood, if you're drawing a milliliter, say, is going to be filled into the pipetter?
Very roughly, probably between a third and 2/3. I believe a milliliter would fall somewhere around in there, but I'm not totally sure of that.
So you're estimating,
Strike, no foundation.
Sustain, rephrase the question.
well, can you give us your best estimate as to where a milliliter would be in this file? And just tell us the parameters of your margin of error.
Objection, no foundation.
Sustain.
Sir, have you ever drawn a milliliter into one of these pipetters before?
I'm sure I have approximately at some point.
Okay. And when you do this routinely, do you pay very, very close attention to exactly where it is?
No, this, like I mentioned, this is not a calibrated instrument. It's just for removing some fluid and delivering it somewhere else.
And when you say it's not calibrated, what do you mean by that?
Oh, there's no marks on it to indicate different volume levels. It's merely a device to transfer some fluid from point A to point B.
Now, when you use this on the reference file 17, can you give us an estimate, to the best of your abilities, as to how much of the disposable pipetter was actually occupied by blood from item 17?
Objection, no foundation.
What time are we talking about? Which incident?
Well, you did it on the 27th, I think. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
And can you tell us?
I have no independent recollection of that particular moment, and I don't pay attention to exactly how much is drawn each time.
Okay, so we have no way of then being able to reconstruct with any high degree of accuracy exactly what that amount is.
That's correct.
Is that correct? Now, Mr. Matheson, when you perform this function, what do you do with the amount of blood that's left on the inside and outside of the disposable pipetter?
It's discarded.
And why don't you make some effort to try to recover that and return it to the blood vial?
Well, there's no reason to it. You have a blood vial that has quite a bit of blood in it in comparison to what we eventually end up using for our testing. There's plenty left for additional one. You use that, draw some up, You squirt it out. I mean, you don't throw it away full or something. You use your bulb, squirt out as much as you can, and discard the rest.
Now, I'd like to put the pipette man up on the Elmo so that we can print this photograph. Apparently, we need to do that mechanically. Do you have to lower the photograph? While that's printing it, can I continue to
You may.
ask questions? Thank you. Now, Mr. Matheson, within the Scientific Investigations Division, are there any type of other pipetters other than the two that we've discussed today, which are used in taking blood from reference vials?
Yes, there is.
What is this other type?
It's just another type of disposable pipette. It's made out of plastic rather than glass.
Your Honor, when we have the picture printed, can I mark that as people's next in order? I guess it's 226.
227.
And Mr. Matheson, would there be any problem with us introducing the actual tip of the pipette man as an exhibit? Can we
No.
have that? Maybe we can have the tip of the pipette man as 228.
All right, People's 228, the disposable pipetter.
Sir, did you bring an example of this other pipetter to court with you this morning?
Yes, I did.
Can you show us that?
This is a example of one of the other type of pipetters that are used by in our laboratory. It's all in one unit as opposed to the glass one, which had a separate bulb on the top. This one has one built into it, and it works the same way as the glass one. You squeeze the top, stick it into the fluid, let it out, release the top, draws it up inside of it, and then you squeeze it again to deliver it where you want.
Which division uses toxicology?
They do mainly, but it's occasionally used in serology.
And in using this item to draw blood, what is the procedure in the laboratory with respect to what you do with the blood that stays on the inside or clings to the outside during the transaction?
Well, similar to the glass disposable pipette and the disposable tips on the pipetter, once you have squeezed it and delivered as much as you can out of it, this is discarded in a biohazard waste disposal.
And why isn't any further effort tried to made to retrieve whatever is clinging to the inside and outside of the pipetter in order to return it to its vial?
Again, it is not seen as being necessary to return every little microliter of blood that's present pulled out of a liquid blood tube.
So it's just thrown away and lost forever?
That's correct.
And do you have any personal knowledge with respect to the testing that was done in toxicology, I believe, on June the 20th, with respect to exactly how much blood was pipetted into one of these pipetters?
No, I do not.
And do you know how much blood remained on the inside and outside of the pipetter after that transaction was complete?
No, I do not.
So, Mr. Matheson, we have no way of being able to reconstruct with precision exactly how much blood was actually tossed out during that transaction. Is that true?
That's correct.
So, all of these numbers that were placed on the defense chart, were they exact numbers or approximations?
They would all be approximations.
And did any of those numbers take into account the amounts that are lost during the transactions dealing with the blood? In other words, on pipetters, on gloves, on Kim wipes, and the like?
No, I don't believe they did.
So the defense chart is therefore incomplete and inaccurate. Is that correct?
Counsel, that's an argumentative question. And which board are you referring to, which exhibit?
I'm referring to the exhibit that's been marked. If I can see it. as 11.
11:39.
39. Defense Board accurate?
No, I don't believe so.
Now, also, well, I'll get into that later. Let's start up again with the the September the 30th transaction, where you testified that you delivered 1 milliliter of blood to Mr. Regal.
Okay.
When you said delivered 1 milliliter of blood, what did you mean by that?
That rather than just estimating, I used a pipetter, either like the one I described, like I said, we have a couple other different brands that they work basically the same, they just look differently. Use that same type of tip, set the pipetter to 1 milliliter, and transferred that amount from the blood vial into a microcentrifuge tube that we've talked about before, the small conical plastic tube.
And Mr. Matheson, could you place a 1 milliliter sticker on the defense blood vial chart?
Directly above the 2.6?
Yes. Now, Mr. Matheson, is the 1 milliliter that's represented there an exact measure or an approximate?
It's an approximation.
Why?
Well, as mentioned before, even though the pipetter is set, and I believe that I delivered, approximately 1 milliliter into this microcentrifuge tube, there is going to be a small amount that's going to be lost when you remove the cap, and that's going to be clinging to the sides of the tip that's going to be discarded.
I think we've heard this now about 6 times.
But we're going to go all the way up the chart, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Matheson, in order for this to be accurate, therefore, shouldn't the chart reflect that it is an approximation as opposed to an exact, precise figure?
It's argumentative as well. Sustained.
Is there a symbol that you use in science when you're talking about measurements for the purposes of showing that something is an approximation?
Yes, there is.
And can you write that symbol on the 1 milliliter portion just to signify that?
Before we do that, I'm sorry. 1492 indicates you can't see. And Mr. Blasier, do you have any objection to the prosecution marking on your board?
No, I'm just going to mark my tabs. I'm not going to mark their board.
$14.92? All right, thank you.
Yeah, remarking, it's just kind of a squiggle that's an indication of approximation.
Now, when the 1 milliliter was put on for this transaction on the defense board, was that squiggle there?
No, it was not.
Now, I'd like to direct your attention next to the date of June the 27th, when you did some testing.
Okay.
As to item 17. How much did you use? And when I say use, I'm talking not only about what was consumed in the tests, but in total.
Objection has been answered, no foundation. Said he didn't
We've
remember.
asked this question already.
I believe you testified it was between 0.5 milliliters and
Sustained.
1 milliliter. Is that correct?
Sustained. And it's leading. We've asked this question.
Let's take the higher of the two sums, 1 milliliter. Is that an exact sum or an approximation?
Objection, assumes facts not noted.
Sustained.
No, that's,
Sustained. Don't argue with me, counsel.
Mr. Matheson, could you have used as much as 1 milliliter in total with respect to that transaction?
Objection calls for speculation.
It's leading as well. Sustained.
How much is the maximum amount you could have used in connection with that transaction?
Objection, no foundation.
Overruled.
Conservatively, about 1 milliliter.
Okay, and is that an exact figure or an estimate?
It's an approximation.
And can you place another milliliter on the board and also place one of the squiggles on it to indicate approximation? When you use the term conservatively, Mr. Matheson, did you mean that it could be slightly more than that or slightly less than that?
Objection, B.
Sustained.
Did you mean when you said what did you mean when you said conservatively?
I believe the question was a maximum amount I could have used. It could have been a little bit higher than that, which is why I said conservatively 1 milliliter.
But could have it also been less?
Yes.
Objection, move to strike, no foundation.
Overruled.
Now, Mr. Matheson, at the time that there was a period of time when you spoke to Mr. Regal about this transaction, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
At that time, did you have a clear, independent recollection as to exactly what you did in terms of removing blood from the vial for your testing on the 27th?
No, I did not.
And were you trying to make clear mental notes of that at the time on the 27th?
No, I was not.
Now, directing your attention next to the date of June the 25th that you testified about. On that date, Mr. Yamauchi did some testing, is that correct?
Yes, he did.
And according to the records that you previously read, did he state that he used .75, or did he have one of the squiggles in his notes?
I believe there was an approximation mark on it.
Okay, now when the defense put their sticker on the chart, did their sticker for that contain the approximation that Mr. Yamauchi wrote in his notes?
No, it did not.
So was the sticker from the defense a accurate representation of what was reflected in Mr. Yamauchi's records?
Objection, argument.
Sustained.
Was the sticker correct?
No.
No foundation.
Overruled.
As per what was written in the notes, no.
Sir, could you now place a .75 sticker on the chart and give us an approximation, one of the approximation signs? We have permission to lower the chart a little at this time for my next set of questions, since the bottom has become slightly less relevant.
Slightly.
Either that or we're going to need a poll.
All right, how about right there?
Now, with respect to the next date, June the 20th, did you place a sticker on when the defense was questioning you for .70, to your recollection?
Yes, I believe we did.
Do you know where that number comes from?
It was reflective of what toxicology did. I am not aware of the exact number.
But did you find an actual record that contained that .70?
I don't believe so, no.
And do you have any personal knowledge of exactly how that .70 was arrived at?
No, I do not.
Okay. Are any of your measures that you do in the laboratory accurate to within 0.1 milliliters generally?
Any measurement?
Well, measurements of blood from a vial in connection with transactions such as the ones that they do in toxicology.
I don't believe so, no.
Okay, so this .7, wherever it came from then, is not an exact figure, is that correct?
Objection, argument.
Well, it's speculative. Sustained.
Sir, based upon your understanding of the practices in toxicology, is that an exact figure as in .70000?
Objection, speculation.
Sustained.
Sir, do you have any personal knowledge of how exact that figure is?
No, I do not.
So at this point, we have no way of reconstructing, you have no way of reconstructing whether it was 0.7 or 0.8 or 0.9 or 0.5, do you?
Objection, argumentative.
Sustain.
Do you have any personal knowledge of whether it was any of those sums?
Objection, asked and answered.
No, it's a different question, only slightly though.
What I know about the 0.7 is what was discussed here in the courtroom the other day.
No personal knowledge.
That's correct.
All right, well, let's just take the 0.7, if we have one, and put that back up on the blood vial chart. Thank you.
And adding on to it the approximation sign.
And do you have any personal knowledge as to how much would have been lost in the transaction relating to this 0.7 milliliters, if it was 0.7 milliliters?
For just this one transaction, no, I do not.
All right. Now, Mr. Matheson, going to the next date of June the 14th, according to your records that you looked at yesterday during cross-examination, did Mr. Yamauchi use 1 milliliter for swatching? Approximately 1 milliliter.
Approximately 1, yes.
And in his notes, did he have one of the squiggles to indicate it was an approximation?
I believe so, yes.
When you placed the sticker on the defense chart, did it contain one of those squiggles that was contained in Mr. Yamauchi's notes?
No, it did not.
Was their chart correct in that regard?
Objection, argumentative.
Sustain.
Now, Mr. Matheson, can you now place a sticker on the chart for 1 milliliter and again place one of the transaction symbols on it? One of the approximation symbols, rather. Now, Mr. Matheson, with respect to each one of the transactions that we've just testified to and that you testified to on cross-examination, the 5 transactions, did you duplicate those transactions last night when you went back to the laboratory after your testimony in court?
I duplicated the actions that would be associated with that type of transaction as they've been described here.
I'm going to object to any further testimony on this. Improper, doesn't mirror the conditions that we know.
It's called foundation, counsel.
No foundation. Sorry.
This is just my first question, Your Honor.
I know, I haven't heard anything else, so I'll take that as a premature objection.
Now, Mr. Matheson, when you say you duplicated them, let's start with the September the 30th, working our way down from bottom to top. September 30th transaction, what did you do?
Well, what I wanted to do was reproduce the way 1 milliliter of blood would be removed from the vial and then placed in another, like the centrifuge tube, and released. So I took a pipetter, set it to 1 milliliter, removed the cap of the blood vial like I would, using gloves and Kim wipe, laying it on the counter, used the pipetter, removed 1 milliliter, and rather than delivering it to something else, I delivered it back into the tube and then discarded the tip, recapped the blood vial, and that was the completion of that transaction.
And when you started, did you have a certain amount of blood in the blood vial?
Yes, prior to doing any of this, like I described earlier, placed a similar blood vial next to it that was empty, putting them on a table, adding water to it till it was, to the same height, capped that one and set it aside. Marked it as a starting volume.
Isn't there a certain margin of error in that measuring technique as well?
Yes, it's still, you are using your eye, even though you have it on a flat surface, using your eye to fill it up to, as close as possible to the same level, but there is a slight error associated with that.
Okay, and for what purpose were you doing this, by the way?
I had really no strong idea of how much blood might be lost during the course of a number of opening and closing and transactions with the blood vial, and I was curious to find out if it was measurable.
And have any experiments been done, to your knowledge, previously to this to try to calculate what is lost in the transactions, the various transactions associated with the blood vial?
Not to my knowledge.
Now, Mr. Matheson, after you did this replication of the transaction well, let me ask you a few other questions first. In terms of the transaction that you replicated as to the September the 30th transaction, what did you do with the 1 milliliter of blood that was pipetted out?
I returned it back to the blood vial.
I mean, after you were all finished?
Well, I didn't. What I wanted to do was capture the amount that would be used during the transfer process. If I had taken that milliliter of blood, put it into another container, and then returned it a later time or tried to measure that other container, it would have been additional error because there would have been something clinging to it that was not part of the transaction we're trying to duplicate. So I merely, like I said, removed the 1 milliliter, pulled the pipette out of the blood, and then, like I said, depressed the plunger and returned the blood to the same blood vial.
What did you do with the pipette tip, your gloves, and the Kim wipe?
Well, at that point, I didn't change my gloves because I'm working all with the same item. The pipette tip and the Kim wipe that was used to remove the cap and put it back on again, at that point was just placed into a pile in front of me, eventually made its way into a biohazard container.
Okay, now let's go to the June the 27th transaction. What did you do to replicate the blood that you removed from the vial personally for your testing on that date?
Well, in that case, this is the testing that I did, and like I've testified, I don't really remember whether I discarded, after removing a portion of the blood to spin down for the ABO test, putting it in a microcentrifuge tube. I don't know if I discarded that complete with all the blood in it, or if I made an attempt to return it back to the blood vial. Wanting to be, as conservative as possible, I assumed that I returned it to the blood vial. So what I did, again, was took the vial, removed the cap using the Kim wipe and gloves like I've described. I used one of the glass dispo pipettes, because that's the type I use, inserted it into the blood vial, and transferred some of that blood into a microcentrifuge tube. I then capped that tube, put it into a centrifuge to spin it down. I wanted to actually start the process of running an ABO test and place the dirty disposable pipette, I think I testified to before, in a test tube that was sitting also alongside. So now it's just like it's being held there. When the tube...
Ask another question.
What did you do next?
The tube was done centrifuging, brought it back to my work area, removed 3 drops of serum and 3 drops of cells, just as if I was running an ABO test. I then used the glass disposable pipette that I had before, sucked up as much of the blood in the centrifuge tube as I could, returned that to the blood vial, recapped the blood vial, and discarded all the items that had been used during that process.
Okay, now when you say all the items, you mentioned a microcentrifuge tube, a disposable pipette, a test tube, and a Kim wipe. Have I missed anything?
Yes, there is one thing that I left out of that, and that is a very small capillary tube that's used to deliver the small drops for the test.
All right, and the capillary tube. And as to those 5 items, what did you do with those?
They were just placed in a pile in front of me to be discarded.
Now, with respect to the June 25th transaction, where Mr. Yamauchi, according to his notes, used approximately 0.75 milliliters, what did you do to replicate that?
In that transaction, I used a disposable pipette rather than the calibrated one, because that is what's used in a situation like this. We're not removing an exact amount. Placed it, reopened the cap again using the Kim wipe and the gloves, removed a portion into the disposable pipette, pulled it out of the tube, and then returned as much of it as I could back into the vial, recapped the vial, and set it aside, and then disposed of the disposable pipette.
Okay, now let's go through all of the items that you used here that were disposable. There's a disposable pipette, did you say microcentrifuge tube?
For the June 25th?
Yes,
No, just the disposable pipette, that's it.
that's the only thing.
Yes.
All right, and what did you do with the disposable pipette?
Disposed of it. Put it on the pile of the stuff that eventually is going to get thrown away.
And did that still have some blood on it, or residue of blood, when you put it in this disposable pile?
It has some adhering to the inside and a little bit on the outside of the tip.
Now, with respect to the June the 20th transaction in toxicology, what did you do to replicate that?
Basically the same thing that I just described is the one that Mr. Yamuchi was involved in, but rather than using the glass disposable pipette, I used the plastic one like I was shown to you before, because that's the implement they use.
And have you worked with the plastic disposable pipettes before?
Yes, I have.
Do the plastic disposable pipettes have the same amount of blood clinging to them after you're finished as the glass ones?
Oh, it's hard to tell by just looking at them, but just visually it looks like it has a little bit more, but it's not measurable.
Objection, not foundation, move to strike.
Overruled.
So what were the items? Did you use the Kim wipe again in order to open up the vial?
A different one, yes.
Okay. And you used the disposable pipetter.
Yes.
And what else did you use?
In that transaction, that was it.
What did you do with those two items?
They were added to the pile of things that are going to be disposed of.
And then, sir, did you do something to replicate the June 14th? Oh, I'm sorry. And as to those two items, did they still have some blood on them when you added them to the trash pile?
Yes, they did.
Now, did you do something to replicate the June 14th transaction?
Yes, I did.
What?
This is very similar to the first one that was described in the fact that it was mentioned that about 1 milliliter was used for swatching. I used a calibrated, repeatable pipette like we showed you, the Pipette Man. I probably used a different brand. I, again, set the vial up, used the Kim wipe, removed the cap, set that down on the table, used the pipetter to draw up 1 milliliter of blood, pulled it out of the blood, and then returned what was in the pipette tip back to the vial, recapped the vial, and disposed of the tip.
What did you do with the Kim wipe that you used for the purposes of opening up the vial?
It was added to the pile of things to be disposed.
And did both of those two items have some blood on them?
The Kim wipe and the tip, yes, they both still had some.
Now, up to this point, you hadn't changed your gloves, is that correct?
That's correct.
This was the last transaction that you replicated?
Yes, it was.
Although, did you actually do it in the order that I went through, or did you do it in the other order?
I did it in the reverse order.
Okay. Now, Mr. Matheson, what did you do with the gloves that you were wearing?
Well, when I was all done, I removed them and added them to the pile that was going to be disposed of.
So by now you had a fair pile of disposable items that you'd used in replicating these various transactions that had blood on them.
I had a pile of trash in front of me.
Well, what did you do with that?
That was gathered up and placed into a biohazard trash receptacle that we have.
And was there some blood on each one of those disposable items that you threw away?
Yes.
Now, as a result of this, Mr. Matheson, did you calculate how much blood was lost in the transactions? In other words, as a result of using these various things that were thrown away in the garbage?
Yes, I did.
What?
Well, upon completion of all these, I repeated the measurement step that I did at the beginning, taking a second empty blood vial, placing it alongside of the vial that has the blood in it, filling it to where I could see look like the same level, and I placed that blood vial aside. Now I had a before beginning and a completed 2 blood vials that contained equivalent amounts of water to the blood that I saw in the tube at that time.
What was the difference?
It was approximately 0.4 to 0.5 milliliters, or about a half a milliliter.
Now, sir, with respect to that figure, is that an exact figure, or is that also an approximation?
Definitely not exact, it's an approximation.
So if you were writing it out, would you also put a squiggly in front of it?
Yes, I would.
Now, what was the substance that you used for this, was it actually blood?
Yes, it was.
Now, Mr. Matheson, when you were doing these series of transactions, were you trying to be extra sloppy in order to spill as much blood as possible? I mean, how were you doing it?
Objection sustained.
How were you doing it?
I was doing it as close to the way as I would normally do it when I'm doing casework.
All right. And when you're giving this figure, are you saying that that is the amount that would always be lost in this series of transactions, or just your best effort to give us an approximation?
It is an approximation based on the tests I ran yesterday.
Now, Mr. Matheson, can you put up a 5 milliliter item onto our board and place one of the squigglies on it to indicate that it's an approximation?
Say 0.5 milliliter.
0.5.
I'm going to put the squiggle on down here. I can get it.
Now, Mr. Matheson, it's the, with respect to the 2.6 milliliters itself, you took that measurement, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And you used the method that you've previously described with filling up the vial.
Yes.
So is that an exact measure, or again, does that have a margin of error to it?
It is not exact. It's a approximation.
So if we wanted to make this chart correct, we should also probably have a squiggly in front of that. Is that true?
Yes.
I don't want to write on the defense chart, but can you just add a little squiggly onto the 2.6 milliliters? Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to mark as people's next in order 2 photos. I showed them to counsel yesterday. One is what appears to be the blood vial, and it is standing up with a person's finger on the top, as people's
229, I believe.
229. And as 228, a picture of what appears to be a microcentrifuge tube,
230, you mean?
and it is also standing up.
230.
I'd like to place 229 on the Almo first. Oh, shoot, we're going to have blood vial chart again. We lower it and then put it back up again, and we'll go back to it. Thank you. Mr. Matheson, directing your attention to the vial that's been marked, the photograph of the vial that's been marked 228 vial.
I think the photo was 229.
You're right, Your Honor. I'm sorry. 229. It's actually sort of hard to tell for some reason on the Elmo, but in this picture, is this vial actually standing up? Do you need to see the picture?
No, it appears it's standing on, well, it is. It's standing on the bottom part of it with the cap on the top.
Now, Mr. Matheson, was there an occasion where the blood vial was measured by someone else in your presence using a ruler
Yes, there was.
and a notepad?
Yes.
Who did that?
Mark Taylor?
Is he a person who works for SID?
No, he is not.
Who does he work for?
He is a criminalist, works for himself. He's a private.
Was it your understanding he was retained by the defense in this case?
Yes.
Now, when he was measuring this, can you tell us what kind of a ruler he used?
Would object is irrelevant.
Overruled.
It's just a plastic ruler, approximately 15 inches long.
Why is the blood vial standing on a pad of paper?
Well, that particular ruler, like a lot of rulers, the measurement does not start at the end. It's actually inset, I don't know, 3/16 of an inch or a quarter. So if you ding up the end or knock around the end, it doesn't affect your mark or the beginning point. So an attempt was made by using the notepads to bring it up and account for that little bit of the ruler. So the bottom of the tube was at the same height as the bottom of the ruler, or the beginning mark.
Mr. Matheson, doesn't that seem like an extremely inaccurate way of trying to measure the blood vial tube?
Argumentative.
Sustained.
What is is this the preferable way from a forensic standpoint of measuring a blood vial?
No, it's not the way.
Objection, move to strike this testimony.
Overruled.
It was not my choice the way to do it. I preferred the equivalent amounts of water.
Now, Mr. Matheson, when you actually did your own measurement of the blood vial using the technique of equivalent amounts of water, did you actually have to stand the blood vial up similar to as is depicted in this photograph?
Yes, I did.
And when you measured that, did you take into account the amount of blood that is clinging to the inside of the vial?
No, I was measuring the amount that had collected in the bottom.
And if you look at the top of this vial, there appears to be something a little less than, hold on, a quarter of a, it looks like it's a little less than a quarter of an inch or approximately a quarter of an inch of blood that's stuck up towards the top of the vial.
Objection, leading.
Sustained.
Well, sir, how much, let me take a look at the photograph. Maybe I can show the photograph, because it's hard to tell on this. I don't know. May I approach for a second?
You may. I think that's the centimeter
You're right.
scale on the
You're
side.
right. Can you tell us how much the measure is, or the approximate measure is, of the blood that's up towards the top of the vial?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustained.
Is there a ruler right next to it?
Yes, there is.
And using the ruler, can you tell us approximately how much blood you can see in the darkened area at the top of the vial?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustained.
Well, when you saw the vial, was there blood that was stuck up at the top of the vial?
Normally there is. I don't remember if there was on this particular instant.
Okay. And how does it,
Move to strike, non-responsive.
Overruled.
why is there blood stuck up at the top of the vial? How does it get there?
Well, many times, or usually when the blood vial is being stored, it's in a envelope. A lot of times it's upright. Sometimes it can be upside down or falling on its side. The blood comes in contact with all parts of the inside of the tube, and some of it's going to adhere up around the stopper.
And did you do your measurement of the 2.6 milliliters after the Mark Taylor measurement, to your recall?
I don't remember. I believe it was before.
All right. Now, with respect to do you know whether there was any more removal of blood between the Mark Taylor measurement and your measurement?
Not to my knowledge, no.
And when you measured the vial, did you take into account any blood that was up around the top of the vial?
All I did was measure the part that had settled down in the bottom of the vial.
And Mr. Matheson, are you willing to come to any estimate as to how much blood in this particular picture is at the top of the vial and the inside?
No, I am not.
And is that because you've never made any scientific inquiry to try to find that out?
Sustained.
Why aren't you willing to estimate?
Because I'm not even sure how we'd go about measuring that. It adheres to the vial or the cap. When you pull it off, the cap, it may adhere to the cap, may go down the side. I don't think you could do a good measurement of that.
And as a forensic scientist testifying in court under oath, would you be prepared to give what would just constitute a guesstimation of that amount?
Not of that amount, no.
Now, I'd next like to show you the microcentrifuge tube that the photograph of which I've marked as 230 for identification. Sir, before I ask you about this, other than the incident in court the other day, where you were handed a vial of water that purported to contain 8 milliliters and poured it out and saw that it actually measured 7.5. Was it 7.5?
That's what I measured when I poured it, yes.
Other than that, have you ever tried to make any inquiry as to how much blood will stick to the inside of a vial?
No, I have not.
Now, with respect to the microcentrifuge tube, when you looked at the microcentrifuge tube, did you attempt to measure the amounts of blood that are stuck to the interior portion of the vial over where the blood line itself is, and also the portion up near the cap?
No, I did not. I just measured the amount that settled towards the bottom.
And again, as a forensic scientist, would you be willing to give us any estimation as to that amount?
The amount that wasn't measured?
Right.
No, I would not.
Is that for the same reasons that you testified to previously with respect to the blood vial itself?
Yes.
So there's some unknown amount in both vials that you did not measure, is that correct?
That's correct.
And in order to represent the unknown amount, can you just place the little white item that's in front of you onto the defense blood vial chart? Maybe we can put the blood vial chart back up. Your Honor, perhaps we could pass around a picture of the vial and the microcentrifuge tube, because they are a little bit difficult to see on the Elmo.
229 and 230?
Yes.
All right, hand them to juror number 1, please. Goldberg, would you collect 229 and 230 from Deputy Russell?
Now, Mr. Matheson, on the chart as it exists right now, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 numbers, and all of those are estimations. Is that correct?
Yes.
So would it be fair to suggest that the total number of estimations that we have, we know to be completely accurate?
Objection leading.
Sustained.
What can you say with respect to the accuracy of the total number of these estimations?
I'm not sure what you mean by the accuracy of estimations.
I think you're talking about the precision of measurement.
Well, that they are all estimations. It's give or take a little bit of blood. We don't know exactly how much was used in each of those instances.
And do you agree, Mr. Matheson, that to try to reconstruct and account for every tenth of a milliliter of blood, or even quarter or half of a milliliter, would be a hard thing to do?
Sustained.
How hard would it be to try to go back and to account for every half a milliliter of blood?
I think it'd be a very difficult thing to do, to try, and even if you were from the beginning trying to account for every little bit, there are aspects of this that are very difficult to measure, and it would be hard to account for every portion of blood that's used in this type of testing.
And in any past case that you are aware of, has SID ever attempted to do that, to account for every half milliliter of blood in a test tube?
No, we have not.
And why not?
I think we've asked this
Okay.
question before. Why
Now-
don't we move on?
Okay, thank you. Now, Mr. Matheson, understanding that these numbers that you've provided are estimations, can you calculate the total estimated amount of blood on this chart under these conditions?
Objection, asked and answered.
Overruled.
If you have a calculator, you could use that too. That'd be faster.
Well, the final figure that I come up,
No foundation.
Overruled.
the final figure that I have by adding up the numbers that we have up there is approximately 7.5 milliliters.
Okay. And Mr. Matheson, there is then, in addition to that amount of blood that's occupied by what we have in this diagram as the white space, which you have not provided us any number for. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So under our estimation, we have approximately 7.5 plus this unknown amount.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Matheson, I want you to assume, hypothetically, that at the time that the blood vial was drawn, that there was an estimation between 6.5 and 7 milliliters of blood being in the vial. Or to keep the math simple, let's assume it was 7 milliliters of blood.
Objection, seems facts not in evidence. Improper hypothetical.
Sustained.
It was the same hypothetical they gave, Your Honor.
No. Different hypothetical.
Sir, if you were to assume, for the sake of this hypothetical, that at the time the blood were drawn, there was 7 milliliters of blood,
All
and
right,
that we started...
let me see counsel at the sidebar with the report, please. Mr. Goldberg.
Sir, your own margin of error, you said, in visually approximating what is in a blood vial, just visually, was upwards of 1.8 milliliters? 1.8 milliliters or more, did you say?
Well, in the particular instance that we mentioned, when I estimated to begin with, I was 1.8 off, yes.
Now, let's assume hypothetically that the blood vial in this case had 7 milliliters at the time that it started out at the scientific investigations, at the time that it was drawn. Would that mean that under our hypothetical of the set of numbers that we came up with, that there would be an approximately 0.55 milliliters of blood? Too much.
Approximately a half a milliliter, 0.5, yes.
Well, Mr. Matheson, when you go back to the laboratory, are you going to launch an investigation to determine whether someone added more of the
Sustained.
defendant's blood to the vial?
Sustained.
Now, Mr. Matheson, you were asked about EDTA yesterday. You remember that?
Yes,
And is the blood vial in this case that was used to contain Mr. Simpson's blood, in fact, an EDTA vial?
yes, it is.
And it's your understanding that that is an anticoagulant, is that correct?
Yes,
Now, is it also your understanding, Mr. Matheson, that this anticoagulant is one that can be tested for?
as I mentioned, the fact that it is a chemical, there are instruments available, I would assume they can test for it.
And did you cause the blood vial to be sent to the FBI along with items 13, the socks, and the items from the rear gate for the purposes of EDTA testing?
I don't believe I was directly involved with it, but it was sent.
Now,
Right, no foundation.
Do you have any personal knowledge of that being done?
As far as having physical, I've seen records to that effect. I have not.
All right, jury is to disregard the last question and answer.
and is it your understanding, Mr. Matheson, is it your understanding that if blood were taken from a EDTA vial and planted somewhere, you should be able to find it?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustained.
Now, Mr. Matheson, when you testified as to the people's evidence disposition summary, did that reflect a transaction where certain items were sent to the FBI for purposes of EDTA testing?
Objection, no foundation. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
Now, Mr. Matheson, have you heard that according to the report of the EDTA testing,
Sustained.
Mr. Matheson, hypothetically, if the FBI testing showed that there was no
Objection.
EDTA,
Sustained. Sustained. Counsel, ladies and gentlemen, you were to completely disregard that last series of questions and answers regarding EDTA.
can we approach on that, Your
No,
Honor?
you may not. Proceed.
Sir, are you aware of any evidence of EDTA in item 13, 15, 16, or 17?
Objection.
Overruled. Did you do any testing on that yourself? Yes or no?
No, I did not.
Next question.
May I have one moment, Your Honor? Now, sir, do you recall answering a question on cross-examination, a hypothetical question involving if there were EDTA on the socks and the rear gate, what effect that would have?
Yes, I believe so.
Do you know what the basis for that hypothetical was?
Objection, no foundation.
Any others? Sustained.
Okay. Are you aware of any facts that constituted the basis of that hypothetical?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustained. It's not a proper question regarding hypotheticals.
Sir, if the facts of their hypothetical were changed so as to indicate that the testing revealed the absence of EDTA.
Sustained.
Objection.
Counsel? Ladies and gentlemen, jury, we're going to take a recess, brief recess right now. Please remember all of my admonitions to you. I'm sure you take them to heart. Take a recess for 15 minutes as far as the jury is concerned. Mr. Matheson, you can step down. Mr. Goldberg, I'm sustaining the objections because this is not the witness to testify to EDTA testing.
Well, I agree with that, Your Honor, and I agree that it would have been appropriate to have sustained the objections to the questions that I asked. But I also believe that the objections to the questions that they asked exactly along this line, and the hypothetical they gave exactly along this line, where they stated that there was no EDTA, and if there was no EDTA, would that indicate that it came from the blood vial? And the witness answered yes, should have been sustained, and they weren't. And under the doctrine that we have discussed before of curative admissibility and the open the door issue, and this isn't even open the door, I objected to them, my objections were overruled. The people should be allowed to go into this. The jury should not be left with the impression that there is a factual basis and a good faith basis for counsel's questions when they know that they are contrary to the testing that was performed by the FBI. And if the court would like, we can go and try to find the exact questions, and there were a series of them that were asked by the defense in the record.
Mr. Blasier?
Your Honor, we strenuously object. Mr. Goldberg has just acknowledged that he asked questions that he knew was improper, and every time he does it, he turns to face the jury, and you can tell from the first 3 words of the question that they're improper. He knows they're improper. He's experienced enough to know that, and we object to that. The hypotheticals we asked, he objected to. You overruled the objections. We're allowed to ask the hypotheticals. You've sustained all these questions. He continues to ask them. We would ask that some appropriate sanction be imposed.
Mr. Goldberg, any response? I'm concerned about your admission that you knew that those questions were improper.
Your Honor, wait a minute. I have always tried to be very candid with the court. And in instances such as the staple issue, I told the court exactly what I was thinking. It would be intellectually dishonest for me to say that giving a hypothetical to a witness of facts relating to testing that he doesn't know of would be a proper hypothetical question. But the court also knows that I have disagreed about a lot of the hypothetical questions that have been given by the defense and by both sides. And what I am saying is that the court apparently has a different view than I do as to the propriety of certain hypothetical questions. And I am practicing law in this court under Your Honor's rules. And if the court allowed, and you did allow them to ask what now Mr. Blasier is by implication admitting he knew to be improper, because he asked the same series of questions that I did, with one distinction, and that is that he knew that there was no good faith basis for his questions, and he knew that they were contrary to the testimony that is eventually going to be introduced, then I believe under the rules as Your Honor has set them forth, and Your Honor does have discretion in this. I'm not saying the court is wrong.
Wide discretion.
Wide discretion. If the court has found in a proper exercise of its discretion that they can ask the question, then I can ask the question. That does not mean that I personally as an advocate think that either side should have been allowed to ask. But it means that under the rules that have been imposed here by Your Honor, using the discretion that is inherent with this court, that I believe that that was a proper question with respect to the rulings that have previously been made on that issue.
The problem I have with your hypotheticals, Mr. Goldberg, is that they bring in as hearsay EDTA testing results. That's the problem.
But the way I phrased my question, some of them may have been
About the
phrase.
only EDTA question that appears to be proper in this line of questioning is how much is the standard amount of EDTA in one of these vacutainers, and how much would that add to the blood volume in this case? But apparently nobody wants to ask the only obvious question that this jury is interested in hearing. And I don't know if you're watching the jury at all, but they're rolling their eyes every time we get to the fifth or sixth question that's been re-asked and asked again. And this dueling hypothetical questions is really argument at this point, counsel.
Your Honor, if the court were going to strike...
We're in recess.
Thank you.
Well, let's take up the issue I want to talk about first.
Okay. As to the items that counsel now wants to show the defense, many of these are beyond the scope of this witness's direct testimony and redirect testimony, and are also perhaps beyond the scope of his expertise. Evidently, in the A1 portion of the chart, if the court has a copy in front of it, and 2B, what's being depicted there are DQ alpha results, in other words, DNA results, and showing patterns of inheritance with DNA results. We haven't gone into that at all. In fact, I never mentioned patterns of inheritance at all. The only time that was gone into was on cross-examination from Mr. Blasier, and I did not even mention it directly, indirectly, in any other way during recross. So it's beyond the scope of his expertise. And
All right, 1A and 2B, let's take these up one of the...
3C appears to be a statement of the cathodal to anodal pattern of degradation that's suggested by Mr. Saperstein and Sensabaugh. I didn't show this to Mr. Matheson, so I'm not positive whether this is correct, because I didn't know whether I was allowed to. But it's possible that I might not have an objection to that, because it could be a correct statement or a correct block diagram depicting the
It appears to be
Saperstein
an
and-
accurate description of as it was described in the testimony.
That's my feeling.
All right.
4D appears to be containing an issue that should be gone into with the DNA witnesses. What is trying to be depicted here is that EAP would be found in red blood cells, whereas the cells containing the DNA do not contain EAP. This is something that can be explored elsewhere. I did not mention it in any way during my redirect examination. It's beyond the scope. It's beyond the scope of the witness's expertise.
5E.
This is dealing with DNA results and the like, so again, same objections. Code of ethics, I don't know what the suggestion is here that Mr. Matheson has violated the code of ethics. I don't see anything inconsistent, of course, with this testimony. And it appears to be argumentative, and also it's hearsay under 721. So I'd object to the usage of those provisions. And then it might also necessitate bringing out other provisions of the Code of Ethics dealing with the reporting of inconclusive results and showing that his reporting of the inconclusive results is in fact consistent with the Code of Ethics. So it opens up a whole new area that we haven't gone into. As I understand it, Your Honor, the remaining items here are simply larger versions of what we've already gone over.
All right. Mr. Blasier.
Your Honor, as to A and B, Mr. Goldberg asked on redirect, and I asked the court reporter to provide me with a copy of this. They don't have the full transcript yet, so this is probably not the page number that's going to be on the full transcript. But the question was asked, now, when you were testifying on cross-examination, at one point you said that biological contamination, in other words, contamination of one type of blood with another type of blood would not change the type of the blood that was contaminated. What did you mean? Answer, well, you're not going to, the type of blood isn't going to change. It will still be what it always was. That's the nature of the genetic markers that we deal with as a rule. So by introducing another one, it will not change it. It may overpower it, or it may degrade it, or something else like that, but it will not change it. These two charts are I want to ask him questions about that answer, and to demonstrate that half of the answer is inaccurate, that you can have it overpower it or degrade it like he's testified and have a different type show up. Chart
And
number C.
How do these two charts demonstrate that?
Well, he's already testified about you get one allele from mom, one allele from dad. We talked about in the context of EAP and DQ alpha as well. So you know what the type of the child is by what type of the parent is. And I'm going to ask him some questions about if you mix some blood from person A and person B together, you're going to get a type that's a combination of both of those, which is different from the type of either one of them.
So you're suggesting in these charts that these mixtures are actually mixtures of bodily fluids?
Yes, blood.
All right.
And chart number 3C is that's simply the degradation chart with, that's exactly what he testified to, that Saperstein says is there's one other route of degradation that would give you just the higher B band. The red blood cell chart, that's just straight science. I'm sure Mr. Matheson knows that EAP is found in red blood cells that don't have any DNA. Chart number 5.
What's the relevance to this?
Well, because the relevance is you can't, you can do all sorts of other tests other than EAP, and you're never going to be able to rule out that the EAP came from someone who was a B. That other tests won't allow you to do that. You have to, the only way to do that is to retest the EAP. And chart number 5 is simply to show that if you have fingernail scrapings, they are going to contain material, obviously from the person whose fingernails they are, including skin cells. The fingers are made up of cells, the fingernails are made up of cells, and they contain DNA.
So this is the same argument that EAP is separate from DNA testing?
Yeah, similar, yeah. And then the two code of ethics provisions I provided yesterday.
All right. All right, the objections will be overruled. All right, I'm sorry.
Can I respond to those?
I heard the arguments.
Okay, what about the issue that the court, the
All right,
other
as
issues?
to the hypothetical questions, you want to direct my attention, Mr. Goldberg, to the location in the transcript?
I'm looking at page 51.
Which volume?
Well, it's yesterday's transcript. I don't have a volume number.
Mrs. Robertson, would you tell Ms. Olson I need the transcript, please?
The next two witnesses this morning. May I release them? One, two, anybody.
Yeah, I'd say that's a fair guess.
Thank you.
And Mr. Goldberg, you want to direct my attention to which one we're talking about?
I'm looking at line 21 on page 55,
Page 55?
where does the court want me to read it?
Why don't you
or-
read it to me?
Mr. Blasier, hypothetically, Mr. Matheson, if blood from this case, from an evidence item such as from the back gate, showed the presence of a chemical, EDTA, would you agree that it is consistent with it possibly coming from a reference vial? Then there's an objection. That's an improper hypothetical. It's inconsistent with the known facts. Overruled. Witness, as you stated it, if it was present and if it was able to be identified in it, it is possible that it could have come from some type of reference sample that previously contained EDTA.
So you want to ask the hypothetical, assuming the same facts, except no EDTA is found.
Yes. And then there was actually a second hypothetical, which I also objected to in a similar vein.
And I would object to that hypothetical for lack of foundation. The foundation being that testing can only determine whether something, can only detect something that's there. If they get no results on a test, that doesn't mean it's not there. If he modifies it to that extent, then I have no problem with it.
All right, but what's the good faith basis of your offer, Mr. Goldberg, that there's no EDTA in?
The good faith basis of my offer is that in reading the FBI report, that's what it says. That is what the verbal description of their testing says.
The verbal,
The written description of the testing.
okay.
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
Okay. I will allow that one hypothetical question as phrased. All right.
Okay, I'll phrase it almost identically to what the defense did, except not, adding
Right.
the words not.
All right.
Your Honor, for the record, I'm prepared to state what my good faith basis for asking that question was, and that is that our experts have looked at the FBI results and have said that it's present.
No, I assumed, given the nature of our discussions and the other things that have gone on, that you had a good faith basis for asking that.
Yes.
I didn't ask for that.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you for providing that to me, but I didn't need it.
We have a discovery issue that just arose a few seconds ago in the
That
last
appears to be so too,
Yes.
but let's take that up after we finish with the jury this morning.
Thank you, okay.
All right, sort of piqued my interest as well. All right, Deputy Magnar, let's have the jurors, please. Deputy Russell, I need Mr. Matheson, please. All right. All right, Mr. Matheson, would you resume the witness stand, please? All right, Mr. Goldberg, you may conclude your redirect.
Thank you. Were you trying to run out on us, Mr. Matheson?
No, I was standing right in front of the door.
Mr. Matheson, I just want to ask you, hypothetically, if blood from this case, hypothetically, if blood from this case, from an evidence item, such as from the back gate, showed no presence of a chemical EDTA, would you agree that that is inconsistent with it possibly coming from the reference file?
Yes, I would.
Thank you very much, Mr. Matheson. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, Mr.
No further
Blasier.
questions.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Matheson, would you agree that tests that are performed to determine whether something is present or not can only determine that if there's a certain amount of something present? In other words, if there's something less than the sensitivity of the test, you won't detect it, correct?
Or will.
Yes, if it's below the detectability limit of that test, you won't see it.
So something, it could be present, but your test won't show it.
If it's below that level, yes.
I'm sorry, Mr. Is it possible for us to document in some way the way that the vial appears now before counsel? Oh, it's been done. I'm sorry.
Mr. Matheson, you were asked a number of questions about an experiment that you performed last night. Recall that?
Yes.
Now, when you performed that experiment, did you videotape or take any photographs of what you were doing?
No, I did not. I was the only one left in the lab.
Did you invite anybody from the defense to observe?
No, I did not.
And a lot of the numbers that you've used for purposes of your demonstration are numbers based on your guess as to how someone else may have done withdrawals at particular times, correct?
This states the evidence.
Sustain, rephrase the question.
you had no personal knowledge of how a number of the withdrawals that you testified about were actually done, correct?
I had personal knowledge because I was involved in at least 2 of them. The other ones, no.
Now, when we visited the lab in January, Mr. Taylor did his measurements with the ruler. You recall that?
Yes, I do.
That was after you had done your precise measurement of 2.6 milliliters, wasn't it?
It was after I did my measurement, yes.
Were you asked any questions at all by me or Mr. Goldberg about any measurement that resulted from a photograph with a ruler?
No.
When we were in the lab, were we permitted to open up the blood and take the blood out?
No, you were not.
Now, you testified previously that your records indicate that as of June 20th, according to toxicology, there was 5.5 milliliters in that tube, correct?
That's what was in it on that form, yes.
And that's as of June 20th. At that time, there had only been one withdrawal from that blood vial that we know about, correct? From the records.
That's correct.
And assuming again, hypothetically, that you started with 8, Mr. Yamauchi indicated that approximately 1 milliliter was taken out for typing, correct?
Yes.
Incidentally, you don't need nearly 1 milliliter to do the kind of typing you did, do you?
The kind of typing who did?
Mr. Yamauchi did on the 14th.
Not relevant beyond the scope.
Hold on.
Well, actually, I believe the reference was that he used a milliliter for swatching, not just for his testing.
Okay. Now, for the type of swatching that he did, do you need a milliliter or do you actually use a lot less,
Calls for speculation.
if you know?
Well, my understanding is you use a milliliter for those Fitzco cards, the ones that we demonstrated before.
Okay. Now, would you agree that under the hypothetical, as of June 20th, there is 1.5 milliliters of Mr. Simpson's blood that, according to your records, and assuming my hypothetical of starting with 8, that are not there at that point?
Argumentative. Ask and
Oh.
answer.
With all the assumptions in place, yes, it would be approximately 1.5.
And as of that date, there's only been one pipetter that went into that tube according to the records, correct?
That's correct.
And did you, in the course of your experiment, did you determine how much you would have lost by putting a pipetter in one time to determine how much of that 1.5 milliliters would have been used up that way?
No, I didn't, just the aggregate of all the ones.
Certainly, it would be an extremely small amount. Would you agree?
It would be small, yes.
Would you also agree that the pipetters that are used, well, let me ask you this. How much do the pipetters that you've demonstrated to us hold?
No foundation.
Hold on.
Which pipetters are we talking about?
Well, do you know what kind of pipetter Mr. Yamauchi used?
For his 1 milliliter?
Yes.
No, I do not.
The $300 pipetter that you showed us this morning has a plastic tip on it, correct?
Yes, it does.
And do you know who manufactures that plastic tip?
No, it's called an ART tip, A-R-T, but I don't know, I can't think of the manufacturer right now.
Are you aware that some plastic tips have a coating on it to prevent liquids from adhering to them?
Assumes facts, not in evidence.
Hold on.
I don't know if they're specifically coated with anything, no.
But are you aware that plastic tips that blood or other fluids don't adhere to plastic tips as they might to glass?
Assumes facts, not in evidence.
Hold on. Do you know that?
I'd say it depends on the plastic, depends on the glass.
Now, using the $300 pipetter, how much does that plastic tip hold?
Well, the pipetter that I demonstrated here is a 1,000 microliter or 1 ml capacity. When you draw it up, there's a little space on top of it. So But you don't want to, I mean, that's your maximum is 1 milliliter, but it could hold a little more.
And the little plastic one with the bulb built into the top, how much does that hold?
I don't know.
Is there a marking on there to indicate 1 milliliter?
I could take a look at the one we have and see if it says
Okay.
something on it. No, I don't see any markings on it at all.
Now, the glass one that doesn't have the bulb on it, does that have any markings on it?
No.
Would you agree that a trained forensic scientist who intended to draw 1 milliliter out of a blood vial would know the difference between 1 milliliter and 2.5 milliliters?
Overruled.
Yes, I would think so.
Now, you indicated that when you take the tops off of these purple top vials, a lot of times you get blood that comes out of them, correct?
Well, I think I mentioned that there's some adhering to the cap, and when you remove it, some of the times that gets transferred onto Kim wipe.
And are you aware of what's known as an aerosol effect?
Goes beyond the scope of the redirect
Overruled.
request.
Yes, I am.
What is that?
Well, it's when you apply some force or something with the liquid, it forces it out in very small droplets.
In almost like a spray, if you had a spray bottle of something?
Yeah, that's an aerosol effect too. You're taking and squirting a spray bottle and then putting it into the air.
And that blood would have DNA in it, correct?
Beyond the scope.
Overruled.
The blood that is aerosolized?
Yes.
Yes.
And you used the term in your redirect testimony, splattering, correct? Do you remember using that term?
Blood spatter, yes.
No, I think it was splattering.
In what context, counsel?
In terms of when you open the tube, having blood come off of the top.
I think he's already described that.
Okay. Now, when we were at the lab in January, Mr. Taylor, myself, and several others, we asked you specific questions about the withdrawals from this reference tube, didn't we?
I believe so, yes.
And you told us that when you did your withdrawal on the 27th, you put what you didn't use back, correct?
Asked and answered.
Overruled. I assume this is foundational for
Yes.
something else.
Yes, I did, but I believe I probably qualified it with, to the best of my knowledge or something like that.
Do you remember doing that? You remember putting any qualifications on it at all?
No, but I normally do if I don't have very specific memory of something.
Was your recollection better in January than it is today as to whether you put the blood back?
Assumes facts, not an evidence, and my recollection.
Rephrase the question.
You wouldn't have told us that you put it back if that wasn't your recollection, would you?
Assumes facts, not an evidence.
It's argumentative the way it's phrased.
When you talked to us, did you tell us to the best of your knowledge what you had done with the blood that you used?
Asked and answered.
Overruled.
Yes, I did.
Now, do you recall us having a discussion about how much was used in toxicology and where that .70 figure came from?
Are we talking about in court?
No, I'm sorry, in January.
No, I do not.
Now, the microcentrifuge tube, that's the tube that went to toxicology, correct?
I believe it's the one that was prepared by them.
And that holds a maximum of 1.5, correct?
That's correct.
And by your measurements, when it got back and got put back in the envelope, it had .8 left, didn't it?
I believe so, yes.
And that would indicate, would it not, that .7 was no longer there.
That's correct.
You remember a discussion at that same meeting? Incidentally, Mr. Yamauchi was present as well, wasn't he?
He might have been. He was involved in a number of those.
And do you recall a discussion at that time that involved him about how much he actually withdrew on the 27th?
Calls for your say.
I'm sorry, the 25th.
Sustained.
recall during that meeting taking any issue with anything that Mr. Yamauchi said about what he had done.
Overruled.
Now, what does the term examiner bias mean?
Overruled.
Well, my understanding of that would be is that examiner, being the person that's doing the work, can have a certain bias or slant or, something along that line that exists within them.
Is another way of stating that sometimes an examiner might come to the conclusion that he thinks he's supposed to come to, not necessarily fraudulently but just because you know the result and you tend to see what you think is supposed to be there. You understand what I just said?
Not really, no.
I don't think I did either. Doesn't that mean that your preconceived idea of what the test result should be has been shown by studies to possibly affect the result that you actually see?
Beyond the scope of this witness's expertise.
Sustain the way that's phrased.
Well, tell us what you mean by the term examiner bias.
Well, if a person has a bias, then they have a preconceived notion or leaning towards one particular idea or something.
And one of the techniques, and I think you testified about this in terms of how much information you know versus not having any information, is to read test results in a blind sense where you don't know anything else about the rest of the case, so you don't have any preconceived idea of what the answer is supposed to be. Correct?
That's correct.
Now, you remember the cranberry juice we talked about, Mr. Goldberg asked you about a little while ago?
Yes, I do.
And I represented to you when we did that little experiment that it started with 8 milliliters, correct?
Yes, you did.
Now, when you look at a tube, we measured that in a little graduated container, correct?
Yes.
You recognize that as the type of container that you use if you want to measure quantities, or one of the types, correct?
It's one of the types available, yes.
And when you pour something in there and you hold it up and you estimate how much is in there, you look at the liquid and you compare it to the markings on the tube, correct?
That's correct.
And when you looked at that, did you take your measurement from, withdraw. When liquid is in a tube like that, a relatively small tube, it tends to bow down in the middle, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So if you take a measurement from the bottom of the bow, it's going to be different from the top of the bow, isn't it?
Talking about the meniscus?
Meniscus.
Yes, if you take it from the top, you're supposed to take it from the bottom of the meniscus.
Now, if I indicated to you hypothetically that when I measured the 8, I took it from the top, that would have been an incorrect way to measurement.
Sustain.
You'd get a difference if you measured it from the top versus the bottom.
Of the meniscus, yes.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you a couple questions about security at the lab. Now, the computer printouts that you identified and testified to on redirect only include lists of employees who may have entered those rooms by presenting their ID card, correct?
That's correct.
And anybody who initially enters that unit that may have somebody else with them when they go in, that second person's not going to show up on any record anywhere, correct?
That's correct.
In fact, the times that we've been out there where you've shown us that room, our names don't appear on any computer printout as a result of going into that room, correct?
Right, because you're not issued a card.
And that particular, and for instance, on the morning of this, June 14th, if Detective Lang was in that room, he doesn't show up on any printout either, does he?
Overruled.
No, his name wouldn't show up. He doesn't have a security card for our facility.
Incidentally, the detectives that you work with in robbery homicide, for instance, they know where the evidence processing room is, don't they?
I don't think all of them would. Ones that have been in our facility would.
And when you dry the blood swatches, they're always dried in that cabinet up on the wall, aren't they?
That's our designated drying spot, yes.
And the records that you testified to only show when a door is opened, correct?
Actually, it only shows when somebody displays their card, it reads the card, then it unlocks it.
Now, is there any record in the computer when somebody who is inside the room goes out?
No, there's not.
So those records, there's no way you can tell from those records how long people who went in at a particular time stayed there.
This has been asked and answered.
Overruled.
That's correct.
Now, the garage door that we've been referring to, the roll-up door, does that require any kind of card entry from the outside?
Seems to be open from the outside.
Overruled.
That door does not require a card to open it up, no.
So if that door were open, there would be no record, no computer record of who might have gone in that door or who might have gone out of it.
Well, to open that door, we'd have a record of who was in the evidence processing room, because that's where you open it from. Once it was open, no, that we would not have a record of
Well,
that.
I'm sorry, were you done?
Yes,
Let's assume that you have Mr. Fung come into the evidence processing room with somebody with him. Now, that entry would show up, and it would show up as Mr. Fung, correct?
that's correct.
And then the door is open, and Mr. Fung leaves, but the second person stays. There'd be no record that the second person was in there alone, would there?
Overruled.
That's correct.
Now, the documents that you testified to are only authorized entries into that room, correct?
Yes,
If somebody was able to get into that room who was unauthorized without triggering the computer system, there'd be no record of that, correct?
not on that printout, no.
Now, you also indicated on redirect that you asked some questions about evidence possibly being moved from a crime scene. You recall that? In terms of whether there's full documentation by taking pictures?
Oh, as to whether or not it had been moved from its original location prior to collection?
Correct.
Yes, I do.
And you recall stating that as long as you had a picture of it before it was moved and a picture of it after, then that would be sufficient documentation for you.
Sustained.
Well, do you recall making a statement about the fact that if you had a picture of it in its original position and a picture of it later when it may have been moved, that, in your view, was sufficient documentation of that item?
It's sufficient documentation of the fact that it had moved, yes.
Tells you nothing about what was done with it between the first picture and the second picture, does it?
That's correct.
Tells nothing about whether someone picked it up, took it someplace, held it, and then put it back, does it?
Sustained.
Now, you were asked some questions on redirect about the blanket. And you recall testifying that you wouldn't have collected that, one of the reasons being that it appeared to have just the victim's blood on it. Remember saying that?
Sustained.
Do you recall-
It's incomplete.
Do you recall the reasons why? Tell us the reasons that you told us yesterday as to why you wouldn't have collected that blanket.
Overruled.
Well, I believe I said I probably wouldn't. You know, it depends. There is some variation in how we work when we're out in the field. And I think the reasons that come to mind is that it is an item that was brought into the scene after the fact. It was not present when the crime occurred. And that, you know, if you're visually looking at it and it is very heavily blood-stained, known to have been placed over the victim, their assumption is the majority of the blood on there is going to be from the victim, and it does not have a lot of evidentiary value associated with it.
Now, let's assume hypothetically that there were drops of blood on the victim's shoulder area from some source other than the victim, and a blanket was put over top of that. Could that blood have transferred to the blanket?
It's a hypothetical question. Overruled.
If that blood is damp, yes, it could transfer to the blanket.
So under that hypothetical, that blanket, if that indeed happened, could have contained the blood of someone other than the victim.
Given the hypothetical, yes.
Now, you were asked some questions on redirect about getting to the crime scene before the coroner. You recall those?
I believe there was some, yes, about when the coroner should be called and the body's removed.
Now, you also were asked some questions about whether it's preferable to process a crime scene during daylight hours or during nighttime hours, correct?
Yes.
Do you have any information indicating that the reason the detectives did not call CID or SID for 7 hours had anything to do with processing the crime scene in daylight hours versus nighttime hours?
Argumentative, calls for hearsay.
Calls for speculation.
Now, I think you indicated that at some point detectives may decide to process a crime scene themselves,
Yes, that does occur.
including making swatches.
Yes.
This states the testimony is to making swatches.
Overruled.
Including logging evidence.
Yes.
Do you have any information indicating that the detectives that were at the Bundy scene between approximately 12 and when SID arrived later that morning processed any evidence that they recorded?
This states the testimony,
Overruled.
12.
The jurors know what time, the time sequence. Any evidence of that, to your knowledge?
Not that I can recall at this moment.
All right.
Now, you're also asked on redirect examination if you had seen any evidence or indication of evidence being tampered in this case. You remember being asked that?
Yes.
Now, would you agree that by your testimony you don't know how many swatches were collected, so you cannot tell us if the number of swatches that are in the evidence now is the same number as the number of swatches collected originally?
Asked and answered, argumentative, beyond the scope.
Overruled.
That's correct.
Now, you learned at some point that Andrea Mazzola's initials were not on many of the bindles that relate to the blood drops that were collected.
Calls for hearsay, vague as too many, beyond the scope.
Overruled.
You became aware of that, did you not?
I believe so, yes.
In fact, you became aware that her initials didn't appear on any of the bindles, correct?
This states the testimony.
Overruled. Were you aware of that?
That they didn't appear on any of them?
Yes.
Not as I'm remembering right now.
And would you agree that, well, you were also aware of Andrea Mazzola's testimony at the so-called split hearing in August, I believe?
Not relevant.
Sustained.
You indicated you were asked some questions about contamination and an article by Bruce Bedoli of the FBI. You recall those questions?
Yes, I do.
And do you recall making a statement yesterday in redirect to the effect that contamination becomes a problem if it's occurring and you don't know it's happening?
This states the testimony.
Overruled.
Yeah, in use of the word problem, because
Yes.
contamination does occur, if it's going on, you don't know about it, that is a problem.
And if it's going on and you don't know about it, you have no way of knowing how it might affect test results, do you?
If I don't know about it, that's correct.
So if there was evidence in your laboratory of persistent contamination that you were unaware of, would you agree that'd be a serious problem?
Improper hypothetical, argumentative, sociologically impossible.
Overruled.
Would you agree that would be a serious problem?
If there was something going on that we had no idea that it was going on,
Contamination.
given that assumption that something like that could happen, that would be a problem.
Now, you were asked some questions about the computer system and the fact that it's password protected. You remember that?
Yes, I do.
And a password is a secret word that you're given if you're allowed to have access to a computer so that you can actually get it to work for you, correct?
That's correct.
And what that means is if you don't have that word, you can sit there and punch buttons all day and you're not going to be able to get into the computer, correct?
That's correct.
Now, that particular protection that you described wasn't in effect for any of the evidence in this case until the 16th of June, correct?
Vague, overbroad.
Overruled. I think we've already established the date that these things were entered into the computer, correct?
Correct.
Right.
Could we take down that exhibit and Matheson, you recall yesterday you were asked about biological contamination in the context of whether having one sample contaminated with biological fluid from another sample could cause the first sample to change type. Remember that?
Yes, I think we've talked about it a couple times.
And you said that that can't happen.
In actually changing the type,
Yes.
that's my understanding, yes.
Now, when you're talking about actually changing the type, let me shift that just a little bit and ask you the same question about being able to detect. Well, let me rephrase that. The only way we have of knowing of what a type is by the test, correct?
That's correct.
Now, is your testimony that if you have a biological sample from one person and another biological sample is added to that from a second person, that the results of the test would never change?
No, I did not say that.
Now, can we have slide, I need a number for the slide presentation.
Defense next in order,
1143.
1143A.
Now, Mr. Matheson, you remember yesterday we were talking about that you get genetic markers come from our parents, don't they?
Yes,
And we talked in the context of the EAP system of there being A's, B's, and C's, and you get one of those from each parent, correct?
that's correct.
Same thing is true with other genetic markers that are looked at in DNA testing and other conventional serology testing, correct?
Yes, concept's the same.
Each marker system has its own universe, if you will, of possible alleles, they're called, within that marker, correct?
Beyond the scope, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Correct.
That's correct.
And one of the marker systems that you, in fact, you look at in your lab is called the DQ alpha marker, which is, that just identifies a particular part of the DNA that's looked at, correct?
Yes, that's true.
And that's the primary test that your lab performs, isn't it?
That's one of a couple tests, yes.
And two of the alleles that happen to be in that system are called 1.1 and 1.2, aren't they?
Yes,
It's kind of the equivalent of the A's and B's and C's, correct?
This is beyond the scope, Your Honor.
Overruled. But move it along, Mr. Blasier. This is just to make a point.
Yes,
All right.
correct.
Let's get there.
that's a designation, yes.
Now, if you inherit that 1.1 from your mother and 1.1 from your father, then you're going to be a 1.1, correct?
Beyond the scope.
Overruled.
Yes,
And correspondingly, if person B up there inherits a 1.2 from mom, a 1.2 from dad, that person's going to be a 1.2, correct?
yes,
Now, if you take a little bit of blood from A and a little bit of blood from B and mix it together and run a test on it, you're going to get a type 1.1, 1.2, correct?
Vaguest a little bit.
Overruled.
depending on the concentrations of each, yes, you're going to see those too.
Let's assume they're approximately the same.
That's what the test would read then, yes.
And the 1.1, 1.2 type is different from either of the two types that went into it, correct?
When taken together, that's correct.
Now, would you agree that that is an example of where you could have a mixture of blood from two people that would type differently from either one that's in it?
It would change the result you see, yes, not the type of either one of them.
Okay, but all we have is the result, correct?
That's correct.
Now, you also indicated yesterday that the nature of the genetic markers that you deal with, one marker might, I think the term you used was overpower, or one might degrade, correct?
Beyond the scope, that wasn't on redirect.
Yes, it was.
Over.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, let me read you a question and answer from yesterday to see if this refreshes your memory. Or let me show it to you. Okay.
It's irrelevant whether you remember his testimony from yesterday.
Yes,
Saw that yesterday.
yes.
And the concept you were talking about there was if you have this mixture that we've been talking about, if you've got part of the mixture is either degraded or you've only got a little bit, it may be overpowered by the other component, correct?
Asked and answered beyond the scope.
Yes,
Now, in my example, my hypothetical up there, would you agree that if person number A had been, that sample had been degraded or was only a small sample, and person number B had a lot there, and you mixed them together and did a test, person number B might overwhelm person number A, correct?
Asked and answered.
yes, that's possible.
And, slide please, slide B. Do you agree that in my hypothetical, that would result in your final test of this mixture showing person B, but not person A?
Assuming that the quantity of B was sufficiently high, yes, that could occur.
Now, let's assume hypothetically that the blood from person A is put on a swatch, and